Hello, this is Ron Stallworth calling. Who am I speaking with?
This is David Duke.
Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. That David Duke?
God, last time I checked. What can I do you for?
Well, since you asked, I hate blacks.
Hi folks, I'm Ignatiy Vishnevetsky.
I'm Alex Dowd.
Today we're talking about the new Spike Lee joint, BlacKkKlansman.
Welcome to Film Club.
I guess this is one of those strange but true stories. Ron Stallworth, a police officer in Colorado Springs, late 1970s, successfully fooled the Ku Klux Klan into thinking that he was a white supremacist over the phone.
Crank called them, basically.
Yeah, despite being black, and then basically had a white colleague pose as Ron Stallworth in face-to-face meetings to collect information, kind of gather intelligence. And it's one of those things that's really, really fascinating from just the standpoint of a premise that maybe doesn't have a clear middle or an end to it.
For sure. You can definitely see that in how this ends up playing out. Spike Lee is a filmmaker who occasionally has trouble sticking the landing, but I don't know if I can totally put that on him this time. I think that maybe you're dealing with a story here, a sort of true crime story, or a true police story, that just doesn't end quite as excitingly as it begins, one might say. But there's still so much to like about this movie and how it plays out.
There are very few cases where you could accuse Spike Lee of putting too little into a movie.
Yeah.
And this shifts tones a lot. Mm-hmm. And there are parts where it plays like a really entertaining police procedural. Mm-hmm. There are moments where you get some of that Greek chorus theater that is kind of a Lee specialty. And you've got little parodies of genre, kind of digressions throughout.
Yeah, there's some blaxploitation imagery. Mm-hmm. He's playing on some crime film stuff a little bit here and there.
So Ron Stallworth is played by John David Washington, mm-hmm. who basically plays him as this very straight arrow kind of guy.
Yeah.
And he's eventually paired up with Adam Driver, who basically plays he's his white stand-in in the meetings. He's a narcotics officer. His character's name is Flip Zimmerman. Mm-hmm. What's kind of interesting here is he's taking shots at the ridiculousness of white supremacist groups, while at the same time acknowledging the horror that comes with white supremacy. And sometimes in the same scene, there's a sequence towards the end of the film where he's cutting together a Ku Klux Klan initiation, which he kind of plays for all of its silliness in some ways, with people listening to the story of a lynching that had happened some decades earlier being recounted to them. And so you do get these kind of two extremes, and he's often able to get these kind of nuances and subtleties out of putting two very strong images together.
For sure, and I think he walks that line pretty gracefully through a lot of this. He relies a lot on ridicule in this film, mm-hmm. and the KKK members we meet are all kind of bumbling idiots of one shape or another, you know? I mean, a lot of this is Stallworth, like, essentially crank calling them. And the movie has a lot of fun at their expense, while I think you're right, acknowledging some of the horrible history that the KKK has been involved in over the years. I find this movie really interesting as one of many films about the identity crisis that comes from undercover work. This is not a film that ever suggests that either of these characters are getting in too deep with the KKK in the sense that they're never at any point in danger of seeing any logic in the people they're embedded with. But it is a film that treats undercover work as a prism through which to look at identity. It's suggested that Stallworth has to kind of play a part not only for the KKK, but for the Colorado Springs Police Department as well. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of discussions between him and Driver's character about how well, because Driver's character essentially is passing. He's Jewish, and he can essentially go through, and he doesn't have to confront the kind of daily prejudice and the daily oppression that Stallworth character does. So
there's really no shortage of stuff that he's playing with here, because it's not just about racism, as it's usually tackled, but there's a surprising amount of stuff about Jewish identity.
Mm-hmm. And, there's a whole subplot, there's a whole romantic subplot where Stallworth is essentially romancing this young black activist in Colorado Springs, which gets into questions of, can you make a difference from the inside? You know, she sees the police as a fundamentally racist organization, a racist institution, and he's playing a part for her too. He's sort of pretending not to be a police officer.
Yeah, he says he's a construction worker.
That's right, yeah. Well, at the same time, sort of making a case for his philosophy that it might be possible to actually make changes from the inside.
Lee does introduce some ideas about what might constitute good police work. Mm-hmm. And you mostly get it from the Adam Driver and Michael Buscemi characters, the narcotics intelligence officers that Stallworth is initially sent to work with. We get the sense that they think a bit more clearly about certain situations than either the higher-ups or most of the other officers that he has to work with.
But at the same time, Lee doesn't let them off the hook either. There's a scene where Stallworth basically says, why do you put up with this racist asshole? There's this sort of racist cop antagonist who's in the film occasionally, and they say, well, because we're a family.
Yeah.
And so Lee at that point is not letting police off the hook, and he's saying that this is an institutional problem of all kind of watching each other's back.
And Stallworth is played by John David Washington, who is Denzel Washington's son. He has some Denzel-esque vocal mannerisms that he puts to good use.
Yeah, and I think he's very funny. I mean, I think a lot of this plays as comedy, and a lot of that is his exasperation and also the sort of fun he's having. As serious as the situation is and as serious as the police work is, a lot of scenes in this movie are him kind of having fun at the expense of white supremacy.
Which is embodied, I mean, can you think of a more perfect embodiment of white supremacy than Topher Grace?
That's right. Yeah, Topher Grace is playing a young David Duke, and I feel like it's a pretty good gag at David Duke's expense to cast Topher Grace, you know?
With whom he kind of develops a relationship over the phone. They do eventually meet when the real Ron Stallworth is assigned to basically be his bodyguard when David Duke visits Colorado Springs, while at the same time, Flip Zimmerman, the Adam Driver character, has to play the fake Ron Stallworth in his presence. It's one of many scenes in the film where a lot of the ideas that it's playing with and a lot of the roles that its characters are play acting end up converging in one space.
One of the things I find kind of exciting about this film is that I think Lee is operating in maybe his most mainstream mode since Inside Man, with 12 years ago or something, you know? And I think that that's a very deliberate choice. I think this has been designed to be kind of a multiplex crowd pleaser. Throughout the film, Lee uses footage from Gone with the Wind, uses footage from The Birth of a Nation. I think he's acknowledging the power that these huge populist texts can have in shaping public perception.
And he's also altering that footage in interesting ways. He adds additional sound effects to the scenes, which is kind of, it's one of many odd aesthetic choices in this film that kind of add up to a pretty intriguing whole. And he's working in a lot of techniques, I think in some cases more seamlessly than in a lot of his other recent films. I think, for example, at the rally scene near the beginning of the film, which is Stallworth's first time working undercover, and you have a scene that is handled quite realistically, but then you're constantly cutting to close-ups of people in the audience that are basically just framed against black. And it's this kind of odd expressionist flourish that works very well. I think in some ways that sequence is the kind of the self-image of the film, right? It's this ideal of what mass art should be like. It is something big and booming in a way, but that everybody kind of experiences and reacts to individually and feels like it is speaking to them. I think that's kind of Lee's ideal. I think it's sort of what he's reaching for here, and it is all over the place. I think it is by design. I think a lot of his most interesting films are in some ways scattershot, but that's because the whole point of them is to try to do a lot of things, to try to address a lot of ideas.
Yeah, but I think this one coalesces better than anything he's made in a really long time.
White power! Black power!
Knights of the Ku Klux Klan.
That's us, Stallworth brothers. We're on a roll, baby.